Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag Gamble, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global Perma Youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thanks so much for joining me this morning, Amanda. It's absolutely wonderful. And I'd like to introduce Amanda to all of you who are watching this, because Amanda has been a long-time friend of mine, but a most extraordinary woman who has inspired me so much with the work that she does. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her first. So Amanda is the Executive Director of The Next Economy, and she'll be telling us all about that. She was also the founder of the Centre for Social Change. She's a Churchill Fellow. She's an associate of the Sydney Policy Lab and of UQ. She advised Damon Gameau on the 2040 movie and was featured in that too. Her work has taken her to many places around the world and worked with communities in so many different contexts. And that's really part of the core of your work, isn't it? Actually looking at what is change, how change happens, how we can transition to a society and to a way of living that is actually going to be supporting well-being of people on the planet, is essentially what I understand your work to do. But so maybe we could start there really about what is the next economy and what is the kind of work that you do with the next economy?
Yeah, we do lots of different things, so it's sometimes a bit hard to, even for me, to get my head around. But basically what we're trying to do is work with governments and business and communities around that question of how do we transition to an economy that works for both people and planet. So I guess we're a bit different to a lot of organisations around at the moment, because there's kind of this acceptance, particularly now since the coronavirus hit, that the economy does need to change. It's not working for a lot of people. And a lot of organisations focus on trying to build that power or build a movement around the need to change, to convince leaders that we need to change. We kind of come in at a different angle around working with people when they kind of realise that they need to change, but they don't know where to go. So we're kind of not focused on trying to convince people we need to change. We're focused on helping people navigate that change no matter where they're at. So where is the opening where people are ready, and then how do we help them access the knowledge, resources, skills, or other people that they need to actually make a step in the right direction.
So you've worked a lot in this world of transition. So what do you mean by transition? What are we transitioning from, and where is it that we're actually looking to transition to? I mean, I know that's a very broad and big question, but I think it's a key thing at the moment, isn't it? That, you know, change is happening and transition is happening in and around us, and how do we shape that type of transition that we really would like to see in the world? So in your mind, the kind of work that you're doing, what is transition, and how can you, I don't know, how can you support people to transition in the ways that they would like to see that happen?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I use transition as a shorthand because actually we're always in transition. Like, there's never a state where we're standing still. We're always moving. Things are always changing, and it's not linear either. I think often we think we're transitioning from, often we'll talk about transitioning from the need from an economy that's based on extraction of value from people or the planet or the land or the water resources for profit, to something that's about investing or regenerating land, water and people and communities. But change doesn't actually happen that way. There's kind of openings where there's a crack that appears, and whether or not that crack just gets papered over and we try and keep going with the status quo, or whether that crack appears and something grows through that crack is kind of that question. So I don't think, I guess I use the word transition, but really it's about how do we find our way through change. So probably the analogy that we're using at the Next Economy is the difference between, say, navigating using a map versus wayfinding, which is sort of the ancient art of either navigating by the stars, or that seafarers used to use, or Indigenous people still use today, where you kind of look for signs in nature, or signs to actually will say, go this way, not knowing necessarily where the end destination is, but having an idea of where you want to end up. So being guided by those principles around that we need to move to a system that is regenerating the planet and people, that is more just, that means that, and equitable, that people have access to what they need, not just to survive, but to thrive in the world. So what does that look like? We need to act on climate change. So how do we reduce and absorb emissions? So these are the kinds of principles and things that we want to see in the economy that we're trying to build, accepting that it's never going to be this direct linear path to get there. So it's meeting people where they're at and then going, okay, if we want to head to this direction, what's the obvious next step based on where you're at? Because it's going to look very different for a minister of a government department to a local community group. They're very different. The work looks different, but actually the support around them and helping them take that step is very similar.
So just as you were speaking there, and the type of change, or the way in which you're working with communities is completely different. It's old and it's new at the same time. So where did the inspiration for you come from? I mean, obviously you've worked in this for decades and worked with all different sorts of communities from all different kinds of backgrounds. Where do you feel like a sort of kind of the roots of this way that you're working with is coming from?
Yeah, probably so many places, but I think from a really personal level, I actually went to a one-teacher school. So I grew up in the bush. And at a one-teacher school, you don't have access to a teacher who's like stepping you through things all the time. So often we were given kind of a lesson plan or a sort of a workbook to work through. And if you got to finish your work quickly, you could actually help the other people. I had 3-4 other people in my grade. You could help them with that activity, or you could go and help the other grades, the younger grades, with their reading and writing. And I learned at a very young age that you couldn't just tell someone what to do. You had to figure out where they were at and how they were thinking about that, and then start with where they were at and then introduce something new, help them to play with that and experiment, take the next step. So I think I've worked out that that's kind of where it probably first came from. But then that was it, strengthened through work I was doing. I went to Brazil when I was 17 and started working with a women's group there. And there were the women who were in the poorer section of the town helping themselves. They were just pulling together the resources that they had to actually meet needs of their neighbours. They weren't waiting for someone to come and save them. They were just doing that. And I turned up and just wanted to do something because I walked down the street one day and just was sort of saw this family begging and just couldn't handle it anymore, and sort of this very idealistic 17-year-old burst into tears and walked into the nearest church and said, you guys have got to be doing something about this. What can I do? And the priest pointed me to a church up the road that had the women's group, and I turned up and they were like, well, what can you do? And one of the things that they did was they had a sewing group. I went, well, I know how to sew. And they're like, great, here's a sewing machine. We need 130 nappies. I was like, okay. So it's that kind of, I guess it's a more feminine approach too, of just work with what you've got and more of an emergent kind of way of problem solving. And that was reiterated again when I worked with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal health in Australia about 2001. Again, it was people saying, you're an outsider, you're never going to understand our culture, don't think that you can ever tell us what to do. And I was like very young at the time, so they're like, it's you do not speak, you sit and you listen and we'll tell you what we need. So it's those processes of working with amazing leaders in a lot of different countries actually that are saying, you have something that we need, but we're in charge of this process. So actually meeting that and supporting that.
Yeah. And similarly, sort of the experiences I've had too, and that kind of process of listening first, I think is such an important part. But I know too that emerging from that grounding and that understanding, you have been exploring a lot of the ideas around change and around leadership. And so what is the kind of leadership that we need now? So there's one of actually being being present and listening, and that's sort of part of engaging. But what type of leadership do we need in our world today, considering what's going on, considering that the kind of leadership that we're seeing in many parts of the world is actually not taking us in the direction that we need to go in, and yet we are seeing other types of leadership that is really starting to work well. What is a leader within this frame? What is a good, and is leader the right word as well? I'm just wondering.
I think there's definitely a need for leadership. I think it's been a long journey for me, and I think we've talked about this before. I started out as a facilitator, so my role was to hold a space for people to figure out what they wanted. It wasn't to sort of set the agenda and then get people to act in a certain way to get to a certain outcome, although there's a bit of a grey area with facilitation too, because you are there for a purpose. But I've seen over time that even when people are willing, and you see this all the time with community groups on the ground, people can see that there's a problem, they want to start taking action, but not everyone has the big picture vision that's needed, or the ability to bring lots of people along and coordinate that action, to keep an eye on the end goal, the confidence, and a presence that actually inspires people to trust. I think so. All of these things, I think the need for leadership is still really important. I think we can have really good processes that enable a lot more participation and democracy in our decision making, but I still think there's a role for someone who pulls that together and can own that. And I think now more than ever, in a time where we're seeing around the world that strongman leadership, that kind of autocratic top-down, follow me leadership, is a sign that people are looking for leadership and that they are scared and that they need someone who can kind of hold things together to enable them to have enough, to be able to take a risk, to trust enough to take a step and to take a risk. So that sort of leadership is more important than ever. But we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I don't think, and it's really interesting seeing how COVID's playing out, where you've got those leaders who are very top down and very strong. And we're not seeing really great results in terms of how things are playing out, because people are become paralysed waiting for direction. And sometimes those calls haven't been great because there's no way that any one leader or even government can be across all of those issues. So there's a different kind of leadership. Like, you look at people like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, where right from the beginning she spelt out the problem, and then she explained to people that there were stages around how they were going to manage it. And she gave people the information up front, saying there are, I think, 4 stages to this response. We're starting here. Once we see these kinds of things, we'll ramp it up, and we need your cooperation with this. It's only going to work with you. So there was an invitation in. There was trust of the people to give them information so that they can make decisions for themselves. And it was enrolling their confidence. It was saying, are you going to work with us to make this happen, because you are part of a whole? And it's a very different kind of leadership model. Even within the climate movement, I notice there's like a lot of campaigning organisations feel the pressure to come up with the answer, the campaign. We're going to push for this one thing. We're going to build power around it and make this happen. And that's important, and it can happen especially when things need to happen very quickly. But at the same time, I think we miss an opportunity where there might be opportunities for real transformative change by actually going, okay, here are some principles that we can work behind. Here's the vision that we all agree that we're working together. Engage people around that conversation, around what they want, which enables people to then go out and start taking action in concert. So it's more like an orchestra, like people are doing different things, people are playing with different instruments. But if you look at the whole, they're creating beautiful music because it's aligned with a certain direction. And in that case, the leadership is more like a conductor of an orchestra. It's a very important role. But they're not there to tell each musician how to play the instrument.
And I think you touched on a really important point right at the beginning of how you're describing that too, was about taking the fear out of it, and that, when you get sort of a sense of like, oh, I've got to wait until I'm, I know what's happening and the leadership will tell me what's going on, and it's kind of secret and we'll find out when we need to. Whereas actually having this transparency and having the capacity to be part of that decision-making process and to actually feel uplifted and supported and enabled and empowered through the leadership that exists, I think is a really amazing thing. And like you're saying, it's when you see that happen in community groups too. I mean, I know from even from community garden groups that I've worked with, when there is an engage in an inclusive process that people understand and that they're taken along, it doesn't really, there's sort of no real central boss at that point, like it's really important that there's that understanding from a group perspective about how change happens and about how you can engage in that and step in and out if you want to, and not always have to be part of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of stress and pressure that's put on groups when they feel like, oh, I've got to be part of this committee, and then there's all these rules that apply, and then, they just kind of sort of fall in on themselves, where a different type of leadership, I think, is really needed in all scales, from our governments through to our community organisations, whether they be formal or informal groups. So you mentioned a few principles before. Do you want to just touch a little bit more on what you feel those principles of change are, or leadership? How are you describing those?
There's a few different things in my head. So just going back to, I guess, what you were just saying then, it's, I guess, a question around always questioning who needs to be involved at what time for what purpose. I think there's something, we either go, we need a complete flat structure, or we need a top-down kind of leadership structure. But actually there are ways to engage people, the right people at the right time. to the right level, because I think sometimes we go too far with the community groups, and everyone, like you said, everyone has to be involved in every decision, and there's endless meetings and nothing actually gets done. And there's a really good paper that was written, I think, in the mid-70s by someone in the feminist movement called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which is available online, which I'd recommend everyone have a read of, because, you know, we're so committed to principles around democracy and participation and equity that sometimes we don't have the right processes set up to enable people to do what they need to do at the level that they want to get engaged in. Because particularly if you're talking about society-wide change, not everyone wants to be involved. Some people just want to get on with it, and that's fair enough. Like, I don't actually want to have to manage all of my own water systems and energy systems. I want people who know what they're doing to take care of that so I can get on and do what I do. So I think that's a really good principle around leadership and groups. I guess change, thinking about change, I think in terms of working with people, talking about the nexus between leadership and change, I think about change from a sort of stages of change model, which I learned about when I was doing health promotion work with Aboriginal communities, which is accepting that different people are on that different stages of that change cycle. Some people aren't even aware of the need for change, and so the work that you do with them is about raising that awareness. Some people are aware that there's a problem and things need to change, but they don't see how it's important to them. So how do you actually get that point where they're concerned, or they can see how it's relevant to them? That's the work that needs to be done. Then when they get to a point going, oh, something needs to change, then it's what do you need to arm them with in terms so they can actually take measures to move in the right direction. So that's that capacity building or resourcing stage. Then people can go through that and then go, actually, I'm ready to not just take action, but to lead other people or bring community together. That's a different kind of support that you need to provide people like that. So, and then people move around that cycle of change, or come in at different parts or move backwards. So I think that that's what we're trying to do, is meet people where they're at on that cycle, and then give them the resources they need, or the knowledge they need, or networks that they need to actually keep moving along that cycle.
So what does that look like and how do people work with you? So you get invited to come and work with a community, and what do you do? How does that actually work?
I guess we could probably divide up the work into 4 areas. So one, the actual, what most people know about what we do, is we go and work in regional areas. So far, we've been going since the beginning of 2018 with the Next Economy. So most of that work has been focused on how the energy transition and how reducing and absorbing emissions across all sectors of the economy can create jobs and opportunities in regional areas. So sometimes that's a workshop that we've either been funded by government to do, or a local group, maybe an environment group, or the local councils invite us to do some training or a presentation around those aspects. So, and sometimes that's supporting projects on the ground. So Byron Bay, for example, declared it was going to zero emissions within 10 years. So we supported them on that process, project management side of that. So there's work on the ground. We do a lot of sort of more what we're calling education inspiration. So actually doing work to try and highlight that we've got so many different economic possibilities and options to build a different kind of economy. So that's more that public facing presentations, media, webinars, things like that. Increasingly, we're doing a lot of work with decision makers within often state government or the union movement, or even industry like energy companies, who are trying to get their head around what their options are. So we've done some policy design work, or just helping with strategy, like actual direct advice around what the next steps are. And we're developing a report for the Queensland government right now around economic stimulus ideas. And then finally, it's sort of a new area, but we've worked out that there's actually lots of amazing people out there who are working on that edge of economic transformation, whether they're in the food movement or housing, or they're often small organisations, often isolated, very under-resourced, but doing amazing work. So we're trying to figure out how do we actually provide a coordination or support role to the leaders who are already there trying to do systems change work to amplify their efforts. And we're looking at some programs like for what that leadership program looks like next year.
An amazing amount of work.
It makes sense.
Gosh,
Yeah.
and at all levels too. And it's quite, it's such an the change that's happening in the world is changing. Things are changing so fast, and I'm wondering, like you had been focused before on it was the energy transition. I know you still are, and particularly looking at the work and how it influences our response to climate change, and all of that's embedded within there, and women's empowerment and all these, health and well-being, all these different themes are kind of embedded within what you are calling this sort of this economic transition. And maybe you could just speak a little bit to, there was sort of two questions starting to emerge here. One was about, why is it that you've picked, this may seem really obvious to you, but I'd love for you to just kind of articulate it. It's like, why have you picked the economy as the thing that you talk about that represents all of the rest of this? And then how is your response changed, or has it not, with what's happening now with the coronavirus? Is that changed the way that you're working and the way that you see that your work emerging from now on? So sorry, two big questions bundled up there.
Yeah, great questions. So the economy, well, the way I think about the economy, it's just the systems and processes we use to produce things, exchange them, consume them, organise work, and also what we do with any surplus or profit that comes out of that. So we're trying to, so to me, it's how we live. It's how we do all those things that actually support our living. And I'm not just talking about the cash-based capitalist society. If we took all of the volunteers, unpaid volunteers, formal volunteer programs out of our economy, it would collapse. Like our hospitals, our schools, everything relies on that. Households, we're seeing the amount of unpaid labour and caring work that's important. So it's actually, to me, having really creative conversations about, well, how do we do things? How do we get what we need to live is the basis of everything. But we can do it so many different ways. We have so many different options. And we can be so much more creative about that. In terms of how things have changed with the current moment, I guess I've been doing this work for a long time, and even at the Centre for Social Change, we're talking about economic change. And even with the energy transition, we couldn't get cut through. Like, people are like, oh, that's interesting, but people aren't ready to talk about it. When I first started talking about the energy transition work in 2014, literally had government leaders saying, oh, people aren't ready to talk about that yet. Maybe in 5 years. Yeah, we know we need to transition, but, later. And I think, and even in the public, people were really interesting, but they couldn't see the how we were going to take action on it. So, for example, there's been discussions about things like the universal basic income or job guarantees or cooperatives, but it wasn't landing in Australia because I think a lot of people were too comfortable, and there wasn't really that need or that urge or the push to actually make radical change, or change that seemed a bit risky. Now, I think everything's up for grabs, and a lot of the assumptions we had about the economy have been shattered. So even the role that government is playing right now is completely different to what they were saying 6 months ago. Like, it was like government shouldn't be involved in the economy, and now they're dictating everything that's going to happen. So I guess for us, it's meant I had to be very, in talking about the economy, and why we focused so much on the energy transition was because people were sort of saying, well, what should we do about the energy transition? There was we had to be pragmatic and meet what people were needing and what they were asking for. And even in coal mining communities were asking us to come and talk about the shift to renewable energy. So I met that need there. But I think now there's an opening to actually have much bolder, more radical conversations about how the whole system needs to change, rather than just whether we get electricity from this source to that source. We can actually be more direct about saying, we need to think about how we do that. Like, Are we just backing in big private companies and doing business as usual? Should we take public control over all of our utilities to make sure everyone has access as a public right or a service or a human right? Or should we be going to small-scale cooperative community-owned systems that have a whole economic democracy element to it? Or is it a combination of all of those? We can actually be much more ambitious now about saying, look, we've got an opportunity here to shape the economy in a completely and shift the direction in a different way.
I think, that the opportunity that's presented right now to put things on the table, they've been around the periphery for a long time. Decades these ideas have been around and they've been experimented with, trialled around the world. I've experienced communities that are doing amazing things, but it's always been seen as something that's fringe. And I really feel like now is a possibility to bring those, like you said, into part of that mix and to inform something that might happen. And I'm really curious because you talk to people in all different levels of government all the time now. Do you feel like there's an openness to this? I mean, you're saying that this is what you're wanting to put forward, but, have you bounced these ideas off them yet and seeing how they respond?
There's sort of two levels to that. So even before the coronavirus hit, so post-fires, we were doing some regional work, and it was really surprising to me that people in local councils and just general business community people, just people in places like Central Queensland or Southwest Queensland, were the ones bringing up things like UBI and things like cooperatives and community-owned renewable energy, or completely different radical approaches to waste and zero waste. So these terms were like coming out of people's mouths that we weren't raising, they were raising. So I think there was an appetite, and it was all around resilience and the feeling that people have been left, especially in regional areas, of doing it tough on a number of fronts, and they didn't have that resilience on the basics that they needed. So people were talking about food justice and local food systems, for example, and what's happened to agriculture and the power of the supermarkets in taking away people's ability to just buy and grow food locally. So these radical ideas were bubbling there. So there's definitely an openness there. In terms of state and federal government, I think it's been surprising to me how open they are to hearing the ideas from regional areas about how they can build economic resilience. So I literally sent a whole bunch of emails to ministerial advisors at the state and some federal level, thinking that this was about 6 weeks ago, thinking they would, if I got a response, it would be come back to us in a couple of months when things have settled down. I literally got 3 emails within 5 minutes back from ministerial advisors, like top advisors, saying, I'm really sorry I can't talk to you today. Do you have time tomorrow? And I was like, whoa. That was unexpected. I'm not ready to talk to them. So I think they're desperate. I think, and I was framing it as, look, we've been doing work at a regional level on energy transition ideas. I think you can keep moving in the direction that you need to go in, because behind closed doors, they all say, yes, we know we need to act on climate change, but it's whether or not they feel like they've got the political permission to do it has been the block. Whereas now they're like, can you show us how we can do what we need to do and bring people along with us? But that window, how long that's going to be open, I don't know.
So that was my next question, is like, so the community is saying this is what we want. Governments are saying we're looking for a different way forward, and we get it. What's the next step? How does then this change actually happen? Because we're kind of at this, I feel like, well, I mean, it's a simplification, but we're at this point now, this bifurcation point, whereas everything's fluid at the moment, and that as we emerge out of this crisis that we're in right now, there can be either this a recovery project that's, an amplification of business as usual to try and get people back on track, or it can be something more along what you're talking about. So what needs to happen right now to see us head on the path that you're describing, that the community's asking for, that, governments are saying they know the need, that we know that, society needs, communities need, the planet needs. How can, what needs to happen right now? I mean, I know that this is a huge question, and I don't expect that you can answer, because that's like the whole, right, we've done a tick, we've solved the world's problems. But, but it is a big question, isn't it? Because right now it feels like there's a sense of urgency about speaking up right now about things that matter, and putting on the table firmly real and viable alternatives that work, that people want, and that economically actually makes sense.
I think it's going to be messy, and I think that I'm already starting to see, just in the last week or so, the number of voices who are clamouring for attention around their economic stimulus ideas have expanded exponentially. We do know that the Minerals Council of Australia, for example, has been very quick off the mark in putting in their ideas and demands for how economic recovery should go, and they've got direct access to the Prime Minister's office. The head of his COVID advisory group is, Fortescue Metals. So, they're, and whether how much that, but I don't know, I think something has fundamentally shifted. Like, the Prime Minister himself is saying we can't go back to business as usual. So, but what does he mean by that? I don't know. We've got big groups like Get Up, and some of the climate groups and environment groups are mobilising their membership around key demands and trying to encourage people to get directly in contact with their MPs to say, we want you to build back better. We don't want you to build back to the status quo. There's a movement called #BuildBackBetter circulating through social media. So I think there's a momentum and an energy around different ideas, and people wanting something different is definitely there, and I think the politicians are hearing it. Which ideas take hold? Who knows what's going to take hold. But I think that's how change happens. Yeah, it's kind of that sort of things bubbling underneath the surface, and then which thing pops up and is going to actually take root and hold and grow into something, versus it's just going to get squashed or covered.
What are you seeing happening around the world at the moment in those sorts of things that are popping up? I mean, there's things popping up in Australia, but are you seeing other things happening in other parts that we could, bring forward part of our conversation more here?
To tell you the truth, I haven't been looking that much. We're planning to do a webinar series through the Next Economy, looking at how different countries are responding to the economic stimulus, but interviewing people who are working very much on economic transformation and have been for decades, to get their commentary on what the opportunities are to do things differently and what's popping up in terms of different economic movements. So if people are interested in that, they should sign up, I guess, to the Next Economy page, and we can talk about that.
So how do they get how do they get onto your list of information? Can you just share us?
If you just go to the Next Economy's website, which is nexteconomy.com.au, there's a subscribe button, and then we'll send you out any notifications of activities. So that's the webinar series. Will be directly talking about that. But at the moment, I haven't actually been looking. I've been trying to spend the time where things are slowing down and I'm not travelling like a crazy person spewing out carbon emissions, to actually just come back and reflect on where we're at, and try and make sense of the local first. So I haven't been really looking globally yet, but I know there's been some really interesting webinars that Naomi Klein's been doing. There was one that the Australia Institute ran this morning interviewing Joseph Stiglitz, which apparently I haven't looked at yet, but is quite revolutionary and quite inspiring. And I think we can also not just look at how responses are happening now, but also previous responses, like in times when Greece was facing the austerity, how communities organised and mobilised, and that led to political change. There's been some interesting stuff in Spain as well. Argentina about 20 years ago, where we had workers taking back over factories when they were closed. So I think it's also looking at other times and looking at how communities have responded. Detroit and the growth of the food movement in Detroit. So I think there's plenty of examples that we can look to.
And even, I mean, it wasn't such a sort of an immediate thing, but even looking at what happened in Mullaney, for example, it was a dying rural town. Yeah. How did it rebuild itself through the use of cooperatives and women's groups and, local banks and local economic systems? And, it's really quite an interesting story, the Mullaney story, even, here in Queensland.
And there's other examples popping up now with a very similar model. Like you've got Preston with their co-op movements, or there's things happening all over the world right now.
Yeah, so sharing these and sharing the stories of these, because I don't know how much the stories of other ones have been told, but I know the story of Mullaney really hasn't been shared that very much at all, and it's quite a remarkable story. I think it's worth.
That's your job, Morag.
I think so. Gosh. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to our ongoing conversations, because I know that that's something that we do all the time, isn't it? We get on and have a chat about what's going on in the world, what leadership is, where the change needs to happen, and I'm constantly inspired by the work that you do, and I know that everyone who's listening to this is going to be signing up for the webinar series do you have a newsletter as well that you send out, or how does it work?
Yes, we've got one in process at the moment.
Okay,
so, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, maybe next time I can interview you.
Yeah, let's do that.
We can swap. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like fun. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll put down all the links of things that you've mentioned and ways to get in touch with Amanda as well. Yeah. All right. Well, take care, and
thanks, Morag.
Everything you're doing. Okay.
You too. Bye.
So thanks for tuning in to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to have your company. I invite you to subscribe and receive notification of each new weekly episode with more wonderful stories, ideas, inspiration, and common sense for living and working regeneratively. And call positive permaculture thinking and design into action in this changing world. I'm including a transcript below and a link also to my 4-part permaculture series, really looking at what is permaculture and how to make it your livelihood too. So join me again in the next episode where we talk with another fascinating guest. I look forward to seeing you there.